The spoon shook faintly in Unaritzia Karl Hoffmann's hand as he brought it toward his lips, tasting fresh cow's milk for the first time in almost 24 months. For 2 years, the men of the Afrika Korps had grown accustomed to the dry, powdered Ersatzmilch that had replaced real dairy in their units since 1941. The creamy flavor now spreading across his tongue contradicted every message the Wehrmacht had circulated about the supposed scarcity of American food supplies. Later, in the journal he hid beneath his thin mattress, an entry that would have earned him harsh punishment had any officer found it, he recorded a forbidden observation: that American captors offered their prisoners meals superior to what many German soldiers received in active service. It was June 4, 1943, in Mexia, Texas. Through the narrow mess hall windows of the newly constructed prisoner of war camp west of the town, Hoffmann could see U.S. guards eating meat-filled sandwiches with no sign of rationing. By contrast, the standard German desert ration consisted of roughly 300 grams of tinned meat and 125 grams of dense bread, occasionally supplemented by British stores seized during combat. Yet here, inside a country that Nazi propaganda had depicted as weakened by Jewish influence and undermined by democratic softness, food seemed to circulate as though there were no limits at all. That morning, approximately 1,850 veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps marched into the dining hall. What awaited them resembled nothing from the front lines of North Africa. Not a field kitchen pulled by horses, not soup thinned by sand, not utensils battered from years of use. Instead, they encountered a fully outfitted institutional kitchen equipped with electric refrigeration, steam-heated serving lines, metal trays, and industrial dishwashing machines. Every cluster of 5 barracks was assigned its own mess facility, complete with trained cooks, table service, and proper cutlery. Reports from the period consistently described the meals as unexpectedly generous. Residents of Mexia had gathered along the streets earlier that day, watching the column of sun-browned German soldiers march down Railroad Street. What they could not have known was that the breakfast about to be served would produce one of the most significant psychological ruptures documented among prisoners of war in the 20th century. The Nazi racial worldview, constructed on assertions of German superiority and the presumed fragility of democratic societies, was about to be undermined not by pamphlets or lectures, but by the routine presentation of abundant, high-quality food. On their trays that morning lay quantities that exceeded anything most Afrika Korps soldiers had seen during the desert campaign: eggs, crisp bacon, soft white bread, butter, jam, and coffee brewed from real beans rather than ersatz substitutes. The nutritional scale of American agriculture was becoming visible not in propaganda leaflets dropped from aircraft, but in the everyday reality of breakfast.
This moment traced its origin back to May 13, 1943, when Axis forces in Tunisia capitulated. After Rommel had been recalled to Germany, his successor, General Jürgen von Arnim, surrendered along with roughly 275,000 German and Italian troops. The Afrika Korps, once feared for its maneuver warfare and respected even by opponents such as Montgomery, was now scattered into captivity. Among those transported to the United States was Oberfähnrich Franz Müller, recipient of the Iron Cross Second Class and a veteran of both the Polish and French campaigns. Having survived the brutal conditions of 2 years in the North African theater, Müller later recorded a detailed account of his early days in American hands. Decades afterward, his notes resurfaced in the U.S. National Archives, providing historians with the clearest surviving testimony of the profound food-related shock experienced by German soldiers when they first encountered the logistical might of the United States. For months before their capture, many German soldiers in North Africa lived on rations so limited that survival felt like an act of endurance. A typical day offered little more than 3/4 of a kilogram of coarse bread, a small portion of fat, and a scant amount of sausage or preserved fish, and even that could disappear when supply lines were cut. One soldier later remarked that they often subsisted instead on dates scavenged from oases, seized enemy supplies, or sheer hunger. The transformation from battlefield defeat to a profound reassessment of the enemy began almost immediately after surrender. At Tunis, thousands of German troops, including the men under Major Miller, were placed in temporary holding pens while awaiting transport. These makeshift cages formed the first stage of an unexpected education. Here, the Americans processed tens of thousands of prisoners each day with a level of planning and efficiency unlike anything many Wehrmacht soldiers had experienced, even during Germany's most triumphant campaigns. But it was not the paperwork or the orderliness that most unsettled them. It was the food. Feldwebel Hans Klein, captured as part of the 15th Panzer Division, described his astonishment in a letter home written 6 months later from Camp McCain, Mississippi. He recalled that while still confined near Tunis, American guards handed out soft white bread with meals. For men who had grown accustomed to the unyielding whole-grain knäckebrot that passed for bread in Africa when any bread existed at all, this was almost incomprehensible. He noted that the guards themselves consumed more bread in a single sitting than his entire squad might see in a week.
Transport ships only deepened the contrast. The Liberty ships, mass-produced at an industrial tempo unmatched anywhere in the world, at one point 3 completed every day, had just finished delivering war material to the European theater and were now returning home largely empty. Instead of loading prisoners into suffocating cattle wagons, the Americans outfitted the ship's holds with ventilation ducts, lighting, bunks, and adequate sanitation, creating conditions far beyond what the Germans anticipated. These returning vessels carried up to 30,000 prisoners per month across the Atlantic. The July 1943 crossing delivered a second jolt of cultural shock. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer Division kept a meticulous food journal in letters later returned to his family. On 15 July, he recorded a morning meal of oat porridge sweetened with sugar, fresh milk, slices of white bread with butter, and coffee served with cream. In Germany, he wrote, such things were reserved for officers or not available at all. Yet here, even captives received them. What astonished them further was the fare served to the American merchant crews. The prisoners witnessed sailors dining on steak, eggs, crisp vegetables, and even ice cream, a dessert that in wartime Germany had become a distant memory, enjoyed only by high-ranking officials. Becker noted that a single day's refuse from the ship's galley contained more calories than some frontline German companies received altogether. Lieutenant Heinrich Weber, descended from an old Prussian military family and later the author of an unpublished memoir, wrote that as they neared the American coastline, he watched untouched plates, entire meals barely eaten, being discarded into the sea. It forced him to confront a reality he had not fully grasped, that they had not merely been fighting another army, but an industrial civilization of such scale and abundance that it defied their former beliefs. Their first hours in the United States erased whatever remained of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. On 2 August 1943, upon disembarking at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, prisoners were placed aboard comfortable Pullman rail cars that startled men accustomed to the wreckage of wartime Europe. The landscape rolling past the windows, broad, intact, prosperous, seemed untouched by conflict. But the real revelation awaited them at the processing center. There, the prisoners were served a meal that many initially assumed must be some kind of demonstration or special occasion. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes drenched in gravy, green beans, cornbread, apple pie, and coffee sweetened with real sugar. Johann Fischer, a baker's son from Munich, calculated that the amount of meat in that single meal surpassed what his entire household received in a month under rationing. He recorded with disbelief that the Americans apologized for the simplicity of the food, explaining that the prisoners had arrived unexpectedly and the kitchen staff had not had time to prepare something better. Fischer wrote that German generals would have regarded such a feast as exceptional. The long train ride from Norfolk to the camps in Texas and Oklahoma became, for many, the final collapse of the ideological world they had carried with them from Europe. The journey, with its abundance, order, and casual prosperity, did more to dismantle the illusions of the Third Reich than any defeat on the battlefield. As the transport trains pushed westward across Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, the German prisoners aboard found themselves staring through the glass as if witnessing a contradiction made real. The scenes outside, ordinary Americans going about their routines, stood in complete opposition to everything Nazi propaganda had insisted about a starving, collapsing United States. At each halt along the route, the POWs saw rail workers casually eating thick meat sandwiches, sipping Coca-Cola straight from glass bottles, and smoking as many cigarettes as they pleased, untouched by ration restrictions that dominated life in Europe. One stop in Memphis, Tennessee left an especially deep impression. While the train paused, a dining car was replenished with supplies in such quantity that the prisoners watched in disbelief. Workers hoisted entire sides of beef, stacked crates packed with eggs, hauled sacks of potatoes, and transferred boxes of fresh produce still smelling of soil. What was being loaded for a single train journey exceeded what some German divisions had been issued over an entire month in North Africa. Among those observing was Stabskrieger Rudolf Richter, formerly an agricultural inspector from Westphalia before he was drafted. He carefully recorded his impressions. To him, it seemed the American railways moved food with the same inevitability as natural forces. Endless streams of grain-filled freight cars, refrigerated wagons carrying dairy and meat, and whole trains assigned solely to transporting food from rural farms to urban markets. No guards, no camouflage, no special procedures, only a vast and steady logistical rhythm. In his estimation, the daily volume of food coursing through the American rail network could have sustained the entire German population. September 19, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas.
The prisoners' arrival at their permanent camps added another layer to what many later described as a slow dismantling of preconceived beliefs, accomplished largely through food. The United States followed the Geneva Convention closely, aiming to provide POWs with living standards equal to those of U.S. troops. American officials also hoped humane treatment would encourage reciprocal behavior toward American prisoners in German custody, and perhaps influence how these men would one day participate in rebuilding Europe. For many of the POWs, the camp's dining facilities eclipsed anything they had known even in peacetime. Electric refrigerators hummed throughout the day. Automatic dishwashers processed thousands of plates in a continuous cycle. Steam tables kept meals ready long after serving began, and industrial mixers churned dough for freshly baked bread every morning. The institutional abundance bordered on surreal. At Camp Swift, Texas, a prisoner named Unterscharführer Karl Hoffmann was placed on kitchen duty, where he confronted a reality that stayed with him for decades. On September 23rd, he noted that 300 pounds of perfectly edible food were thrown away, not because it had spoiled, but because U.S. regulations required kitchens to prepare 10% more than necessary to ensure that no POW received less than a complete portion. The unused remainder was routinely discarded. The ration sheets posted in the kitchen seemed like fiction to men who had lived under German wartime shortages. 3/4 pound of meat daily, 1 pound of potatoes, 1/2 pound of vegetables, 3/4 pound of bread, along with sugar, milk, butter, coffee, and eggs. The federal government kept careful accounts of these costs, offsetting them partly by charging farmers 45 cents per hour for each POW assigned to agricultural labor. In Camp McCain, Mississippi, Feldwebel Hans Klein wrote his own observations. Breakfast alone, Oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and coffee with cream resembled something out of a hotel to men accustomed to wartime scarcity. Lunch and dinner brought even more. Meat at every meal, vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, hot soup, and dessert. Sundays stood out with full chicken or turkey dinners, complete with all the traditional sides. Across these camps, the prisoners gradually realized a sobering comparison. U.S. military rations were consistently richer and more plentiful than the food available to German civilians, whose allotments had already dropped to around 2,178 calories in 1942-43, and then fell further to about 1981 calories in 1943-44.
Although German POWs held in the United States often entered captivity expecting harsh treatment and scarce food, many soon found that their daily conditions differed sharply from what Nazi propaganda had prepared them for. In several camps, rations routinely exceeded 3,000 calories per day, an amount unimaginable to civilians in wartime Germany. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, where a large group of the highest-ranking German officers were confined, including 24 generals, the level of comfort was even more striking. General von Arnim, who took over after Rommel's capture, stayed not in a barracks but in a small house, complete with a vehicle and driver at his disposal. Senior officers were permitted to employ their own cooks, request particular dishes, and enjoy meals that mirrored those of well-supplied American officers. Their tables regularly featured beefsteaks, roasted poultry, fresh-caught fish, and vegetables that German civilians had not seen in years. Even ordinary enlisted prisoners were astonished by the meals they received. Franz Müller, a writer captured with the Afrika Korps, described a lunch at Camp Shelby in a letter home. Freshly fried catfish sourced from local rivers, accompanied by coleslaw, hush puppies, green beans, and a peach cobbler warm from the oven. He noted with surprise that the African-American soldiers serving the food ate the same items, contradicting the claims they had been taught in Germany that the United States starved its black population. His letter, dated October 1943, reads almost like the testimony of a man discovering an entirely different country than the one depicted in Nazi lectures. As the war progressed into the autumn of 1943, many German prisoners were assigned to agricultural labor. What they witnessed on American farms quietly dismantled yet another pillar of Nazi ideology: the regime's insistence that the United States was an inefficient, collapsing society incapable of feeding itself. From their first season of work through the war's end, POWs in Texas harvested fruit, collected pecans, baled hay, cut timber, and helped bring in grain and rice crops. Several accounts describe scenes that left prisoners speechless. On a dairy farm near Huntsville, Texas, Unteroffizier Ernst Wagner watched his employer pour out enormous quantities of surplus milk because the nearby processing facilities were overloaded. Wagner later wrote that he had objected, horrified, that milk German mothers would have begged to give their children was simply being discarded. The farmer calmly explained that the surplus would crash prices if it reached the market, an economic logic that, to the prisoner, felt surreal amid Germany's wartime shortages. Nebraska, which housed roughly 12,000 POWs, offered similar revelations. Prisoners assigned to assist with beet harvesting and hay stacking saw animals being fed abundantly, sometimes excessively. As Gertrude Paul Schmidt recounted from a corn farm, chickens were given grain without limitation, barn cats were offered fresh milk daily, and the farm dogs lived on meat scraps substantial enough to sustain a German household for days.
American farm families often invited POW crews to share meals, as regulations allowed, provided a guard remained present. These informal gatherings, held in warm kitchen interiors rather than mess halls, were among the most psychologically powerful experiences the prisoners recorded. Host families serving the meals offered generous spreads, platters of fried chicken, heaping bowls of butter-rich mashed potatoes, green beans simmered with pieces of ham,
corn on the cob dripping with more butter, and biscuits soaked in thick gravy. Desserts ranged from fruit pies to cobblers, served with tall glasses of cold milk and bottomless coffee. Many POWs described these meals as more overwhelming than anything they had eaten in years. The emotional impact reached its peak during the 1943 Christmas holiday. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the festive dinner menu resembled something the prisoners might once have associated with pre-war celebrations. Roast turkey packed with stuffing, glazed ham, mashed potatoes covered in giblet gravy, sweet potatoes caramelized in sugar, multiple vegetables, fresh rolls, and 3 different varieties of pie, accompanied by cider, milk, and coffee. At Camp McCain, Feldwebel Hans Klein confessed in a letter that he and his comrades ate until they felt physically sick, unable to reconcile the abundance before them with the conditions their families were enduring back home. It was not spoiled provisions that troubled the prisoners, but the sheer volume of food placed before men whose bodies had long adapted to scarcity. Years of restricted rations had conditioned their digestive systems to operate on minimal intake, and many found themselves physically overwhelmed when suddenly confronted with abundance. During mealtimes, some prisoners quietly cried as they ate, moved by the flood of memories of their hungry families still in Germany. The dramatic contrast between their current situation and the conditions in German camps was unmistakable. German soldiers held in their own country typically received around 9 pounds of potatoes each week, along with 5 pounds of bread and slightly more than 2 pounds of cabbage, supplemented by small allotments of margarine and a bitter acorn-based coffee substitute. Meanwhile, German prisoners of war in the United States were being exposed to nutritional standards many had not experienced since before the war. By March 1944, their daily fare already exceeded what they had once considered normal. And as spring advanced, the transformation became even striking. Fresh produce, practically absent from their diets back home, appeared on a daily basis. Lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, radishes, carrots, and celery filled the mess halls, followed by fruits that had been nearly mythical luxuries during wartime Germany: oranges, grapefruit, bananas, and seasonal strawberries. For men accustomed to the rigid monotony of military meals, the diversity alone was astonishing. Camp bakeries further contributed to this sense of abundance. Every day they produced an assortment of breads, white, wheat, and rye, depending on the preferences of the bakers, many of whom were prisoners themselves. Those assigned to bakery duty reported using more flour in a single day than their counterparts in German towns might receive in an entire month. One of them, Untrasia Johann Fischer, the son of a baker, was stationed at the Camp Swift bakery and left behind a vivid account. "We bake 500 loaves each day just for our section of the camp," he recorded. "We prepare pastries, cakes, and cookies whenever special occasions arise. The amount of sugar we consume in a single day would have kept a German bakery operating for months." By the summer of 1944, even as the Allied landings in Normandy signaled that Germany was now engaged on 3 major fronts, the food conditions within American POW camps did not deteriorate. If anything, they improved further. As more prisoners were assigned to work on farms, they witnessed firsthand the agricultural scale of the United States, a scale that defied comparison with production back home. In Nebraska, for example, POWs laboring in sugar beet fields learned that a single American county could outproduce multiple German provinces combined. Prisoners stationed at a canning facility in Arkansas were stunned to see.
At Fort Lewis in Washington state, another contingent of German POWs encountered similar revelations. Among them was 18-year-old G.A. Bra, captured in Normandy and transported to the camp later that summer. He later described his disbelief as he stood outside the camp canteen in August or September 1944, trying to decide between an ice cream and a bottle of Coca-Cola.
Ice cream, he noted, had been unavailable to him in Germany for years. Coca-Cola he had never tasted at all. In the end, he bought both, remarking that it suddenly dawned on him just how fortunate he was to have fallen into American hands and not those of the Soviet Union. By September 1944, many German prisoners had gained between 20 and 30 pounds after more than a year in U.S. captivity. Medical assessments indicated improvements across virtually every measurable category of health. Regular access to milk strengthened teeth, adequate protein intake improved bone condition, and the steady consumption of fresh produce enhanced skin and overall vitality. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German medical officer interned at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, meticulously recorded the remarkable physical recovery of the men under his care, noting the stark difference between their condition upon arrival and their state after months of consistent, balanced nourishment. By the time the first groups of captured soldiers reached the United States, many of them were in a state of severe physical decline. Months of inadequate rations had left countless men weakened by scurvy, pellagra, and other illnesses rooted in chronic malnutrition. Within a year of receiving standard U.S. Army meals, their appearance had changed so dramatically that even the prisoners themselves struggled to recognize their former condition. The shift was not only bodily, it profoundly altered their outlook. One prisoner, Gerecht Wilhelm Becker, remarked that among the men, talk of German triumph had faded completely. He wrote that it seemed impossible for Germany to overcome a nation capable of feeding captives generously while simultaneously fighting full-scale wars on multiple continents. To him, the abundance of food alone revealed a kind of strategic superiority that Germany could not hope to match. As 1944 drew to a close, and the German military launched its final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, life inside American POW compounds followed a different rhythm. December brought another holiday meal, and the scale of the 1944 Christmas dinner surpassed even the previous year's celebrations. The menu included turkey, ham, and roast beef, along with the customary side dishes associated with an American holiday table. Extras were added as well. Fruitcakes shipped in from bakeries back home, striped candy canes, and chocolate, the real kind, not the ersatz confections made from turnip derivatives that had become depressingly common in Germany. Nuts and fresh fruit also appeared in the camps, items most German households had not seen for a long time. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, Italian prisoners who had shifted allegiance after Italy's surrender were even permitted to cook traditional pasta meals. German prisoners watched with astonishment as their former comrades worked with ingredients such as olive oil, genuine cheese, and refined flour, products that had disappeared from their own diets years earlier. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, yet the revelations about American food supplies continued to unsettle the prisoners. Only after Germany's defeat did many of them learn that throughout the conflict, the United States had never experienced the level of rationing they assumed must accompany a global war. Some items, meat, sugar, coffee, had been limited, but widespread hunger had never touched the American population. The nation's agricultural capacity had proven so deep that wartime conditions barely dented its stability.
Shortly after victory, the office of the Provost Marshal General moved to scale back food allocations for POW camps and halted the sale of canteen snacks. Complaints from civilians that prisoners were eating too well had become frequent. Even so, the pared-down rations still exceeded what most German civilians would receive well into the post-war years. When officials finally compiled the relevant figures, the contrast was stark. German POWs in the United States consumed an average of roughly 3,200 calories each day, A German frontline soldier was theoretically allotted around 3,600 calories, though supply breakdowns meant the full ration rarely reached the trenches. Civilians in Germany by 1945 were surviving on fewer than 1,500 calories daily. In American camps, each prisoner typically received nearly 3/4 of a pound of meat per day. German military rations, by comparison, distributed a small weekly portion, about 120 grams, of sausage or preserved fish, assuming any was available at all. For many captives, these daily contrasts in food availability delivered a powerful, unspoken rebuttal to the ideological claims they had been raised with. Abundance itself became a counterargument to the promises of the Nazi state. During the summer of 1945, as preparations for repatriation began, a surprising number of German prisoners appealed to remain in the United States rather than return home. They had seen an agricultural and industrial system functioning at a scale they had never imagined. Hans Wucker, held at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, later recalled that camp life represented a dramatic improvement over the cramped, unheated apartments in which he had grown up. He described discovering conveniences, running water, central heating, consistent meals that many had never experienced before the war. Overall, he concluded, their treatment had been far better than anything they expected when they first surrendered. The reorientation program for German prisoners of war proved most effective not in classrooms, but in dining halls. Day after day, men who had internalized Nazi propaganda about American fragility encountered a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. A full stomach, offered without hostility, did more to undermine notions of Aryan superiority or democratic incompetence than any formal lecture ever could. After the conflict ended, Dr. Walter Schreiber, formerly a colonel in the Wehrmacht and an agricultural economist, reflected on what he had witnessed. He later observed that the rations provided to German captives in U.S. camps would have been sufficient to sustain the entire Sixth Army during the disaster at Stalingrad. According to him, America's agricultural abundance was so extensive that, in theory, the surplus alone could have supplied the populations of occupied Europe. He concluded, "We never realized that we were fighting a country that had already solved humanity's most basic challenge, securing enough food for everyone." Between 1945 and 1946, the United States repatriated 371,683 German prisoners of war. Many returned to a homeland that was physically ruined, politically fractured, and struggling with severe shortages. Yet those former prisoners carried back with them an unexpected resource: first-hand knowledge that broad prosperity was not a fantasy and that a democratic system could sustain an organized, efficient, and generous food economy. A number of these men became central figures in the agricultural rebuilding of West Germany. Hans Müller, who had been held at Camp Shelby, brought home modern farming practices he had observed in the American South, helping Bavarian crop yields rise by roughly 40% within half a decade. Wilhelm Fischer, once interned at Camp McCain, played a role in developing distribution systems modeled on U.S. logistics networks. Friedrich Bauer drew on the dietary standards he had encountered in American camps to advocate for new nutritional benchmarks inside post-war Germany.
Roughly 5,000 former prisoners eventually chose to immigrate to the United States, and many others attempted to do so, but were prevented by quota limits. Their motivation was not only economic opportunity. For many, the experience of reliable food security during captivity had revealed a standard of living they hoped to rejoin. In October 1947, at Fort Lewis, Washington, one of the final groups of German POWs prepared for return. Among them was Ga Gray, who had spent 3 years in American custody. He would later come back to the United States as a successful entrepreneur, but even decades later, he recalled small moments that had altered his understanding of the world, such as standing in the camp canteen and choosing between ice cream and Coca-Cola, luxuries unimaginable to his family in post-war Germany. In a memoir written 73 years later, he described being treated fairly, receiving consistent meals, and earning 80 cents a day, enough to purchase cigarettes, sweets, and treats far beyond the reach of ordinary Germans at the time. In 1985, nearly 4 decades after their release, more than 500 former German POWs gathered in Austin, Texas for an anniversary reunion. Many brought spouses and children to show them the places where their perspectives had begun to shift. One of them, Karl Hoffman, who had become an American citizen in 1955, offered remarks that distilled their shared experience. He explained that they had arrived convinced of their racial dominance and skeptical of the stability of American democracy, but they departed the camps with a very different understanding. The United States drew its strength from its extraordinary agricultural capacity, not from any ideology of purity. Hoffman emphasized that each meal they received had challenged the worldview they once carried. The Americans, he noted, routinely fed enemy soldiers better than the Third Reich had fed its own troops. Food waste, which would have been unthinkable in wartime Germany, was common simply because surplus production made it possible. This abundance was not intended as an insult, it was merely the everyday reality of a society that had overcome scarcity. In his view, a nation capable of feeding its adversaries without hardship demonstrated a form of victory that surpassed military success, the triumph over hunger itself. After returning to Germany, many former prisoners of war confronted the unsettling realization that much of what they had believed had been built on deliberate distortion. What they observed in the United States, its vast farms, its immense factories, its seemingly limitless supply of food, revealed a society whose strength emerged not from intimidation or territorial ambition, but from productivity and organization. Men who had once advanced across Europe under the banner of conquest found their convictions unsettled when confronted with an everyday abundance they had never imagined possible. Years later, as these veterans gathered in an American auditorium to express their gratitude to the nation that had once held them captive, the audience rose in a long, resonant applause. In that moment, Americans and Germans, once locked in violent conflict, stood together acknowledging a process of personal and ideological transformation that had begun not in classrooms or tribunals, but with a single meal served in the summer of 1943.
The experiences of German POWs in the United States reveal the extraordinary capacity of lived reality to reshape hardened beliefs. Many of the soldiers captured by American forces discovered, often reluctantly at first, that the United States' agricultural output exceeded anything they had been told. The sight of overflowing warehouses, efficient farms, and mechanized production lines contradicted years of propaganda in a way no lecture could match. Their ideological shift started quietly. 3 meals a day, prepared without hostility, offered in portions most had not seen since before the war. This routine nourishment weakened the foundations of Nazi racial and political narratives far more effectively than any official re-education program. The depth of that change became unmistakable when, in 2017, former POW Goffgravier, then 91 years old, returned to the base in Washington state where he had been held during the war. He completed a symbolic bicycle ride across the installation, carrying signs proclaiming, "USA, the country and its people, you are my first and final love." He told those gathered that when he had first been brought there in August 1944, he and his fellow prisoners had received fair treatment, steady meals, and a modest daily wage. With that allowance, they could purchase items, chocolate, soda, cigarettes, ice cream, that his family back home could scarcely imagine at the time. His journey back across the base, more than 7 decades later, was his way of saying that this kindness had remained with him throughout his life. Colonel William Pearsall, representing Joint Base Lewis McChord, welcomed him by emphasizing that the treatment of others ultimately reveals a society's character. He noted that such reminders remain important even in the present day, when that lesson is sometimes easy to overlook. Although the physical structures of the wartime camps vanished long ago, dismantled, sold off, or absorbed back into farmland,
Their influence endured in the memories of those who had lived in them and in the political development of post-war Germany. As former POWs reintegrated into civilian life, many spoke openly about how their camp experiences had reshaped their understanding of democracy, prosperity, and cooperation across racial and national lines. A number eventually emigrated to the United States. Others worked to strengthen the ties between the two countries. Their children grew up in a democratic West Germany that forged a lasting alliance with the United States, an outcome made possible in part by the quiet example of American generosity. The approach later expanded on a continental scale in the Marshall Plan, which provided food and economic assistance to rebuild Europe. The philosophy was the same as that practiced in the POW camps. Victory exercised through assistance rather than domination leads to stability, legitimacy, and long-term peace. Historians have emphasized that what convinced many German POWs was not propaganda, but practicality. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a leading scholar of the subject, wrote that the United States prevailed in the ideological contest simply by letting reality speak for itself. Reliable electricity, clean facilities, sufficient food, and consistent routines, all ordinary aspects of American life, contradicted the claims of Nazi ideology at every turn.
The statistics frame the scale of the experience. Approximately 371,683 German prisoners were held across the United States, performing more than 14 million workdays of labor, primarily in agriculture. Fewer than 1% attempted escape, a measure not only of security, but of the generally stable, humane conditions in which they lived. Yet the most significant outcome cannot be captured by numbers. It resides instead in the profound internal shifts triggered by something as ordinary and as powerful as being treated with dignity while sitting down to a well-prepared meal. Modern scholarship on the emergence of a stable democracy in post-1945 Germany often highlights well-known forces: the Marshall Plan's infusion of capital, the Allied campaign to dismantle Nazi institutions, and the unifying pressure created by the Soviet presence in the East. Yet one influential factor frequently escapes attention. More than 370,000 German prisoners of war returned from the United States, carrying with them an unexpected education, an extended first-hand encounter with American democratic life. These men had been held in an environment where they were treated according to clear rules, supplied generously even during shortages, and confronted daily with a society that functioned without the racial doctrines they had been taught to revere. Their reports back home, circulated through families, workplaces, and entire local communities, became a quiet but powerful testimony. No official leaflet campaign could match the impact of soldiers who had lived for years inside the political system they had been instructed to despise, only to find it more effective, more humane, and more prosperous than their own. When the final groups of German POWs left the United States in 1946, they carried with them a record of behavior that astonished many observers. Escape attempts had been exceedingly rare compared with other major POW populations, cooperation with camp personnel had been remarkably high, and the transition from enemy fighters to future partners was smoother than almost anyone had predicted. None of this resulted from coercion or heavy-handed re-education. It grew from consistent decency, transparent rules, and an American willingness to devote resources, especially food, to those who had recently been combatants. The agricultural output and logistical capacity required to feed hundreds of thousands of prisoners were considerable. Yet the political return on that investment proved extraordinary. These former soldiers went home with a lived understanding of a system whose strength derived not from mystical racial theories, but from organized production, civic norms, and social trust. Many recognized for the first time how profoundly Nazi propaganda had misled them.
In this sense, the POW experience illustrated a larger truth about the war's outcome. The United States could provide its captives with meals superior to the rations received by many Wehrmacht troops in the field.
Such contrasts were not just nutritional. They revealed fundamental differences between competing political and economic models. German soldiers who had expected to meet an exhausted, divided opponent instead found a nation capable of abundance on a scale they had never imagined, and one that extended that abundance even to its enemies. The transformation these men underwent helped lay the social groundwork for West Germany's later alignment with the West. Their presence contributed quietly but steadily to the atmosphere that made the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan's implementation, and eventually the institutions of NATO and the European Union conceivable. Families of these former prisoners would come of age in a democratic Germany that cooperated closely with the United States, a development partly rooted in memories formed in those wartime camps. For many veterans, the turning point had been almost mundane. The first meal served upon arrival, well-prepared, plentiful, and utterly inconsistent with everything they had been told about American decadence or weakness. Small moments like this chipped away at years of ideological conditioning. Food became a medium of persuasion more effective than any official speech. Where battles had failed to change minds, the ordinary routines of camp life often succeeded. The experience of German POWs in America ultimately suggested a broader lesson. Durable peace is not created solely through victory on the battlefield. It can also emerge from systems capable of sharing prosperity, even with those who once arrived as adversaries. In that gesture, many prisoners glimpsed a version of democracy that was not theoretical but practical, not imposed but demonstrated, an encounter that reshaped their understanding and, in time, the political future of their country.